The Path, Part 2, written and illustrated by Jennifer Ann Long. There Addison Ann was, under a tree, fast asleep. Atticus Aries took off towards her with a bounding leap. "Addison Ann!" he hollered one final time, as up the hill Atticus Aries did climb. Addison Ann began to stir, but was wide awake by the time Atticus Aries arrived at her. "Addison Ann," Atticus Aries began, somewhat out of breath, "you are a mess. Look, you even have a tear in your dress. You have brambles in your hair, both of your knees are skinned. You have dirt on your nose and on your chin." But Addison Ann's response was to look at him with a grin. Addison Ann then rose to her feet. She flung her arms wide open, and she began to run, and to leap, and to twirl. "Come on, Atticus Aries," she beckoned. "Give it a whirl." And do you know what? Atticus Aries, even though it was very out of character, he did. He ran with a reckless abandonment only known to a kid. He ran, he leaped, he twirled. Atticus Aries had never felt a better feeling in the world. Atticus Aries and Addison Ann ran and played together all afternoon. Then Atticus Aries, noticing that the sun had begun dropping lower in the sky, said, "Addison Ann, we're going to have to start heading home very soon." Hearing the news, Addison Ann's face did drop, and then to the ground she did flop. She never wanted this day to end. For more time among the wildflowers she wanted to spend. And as Addison Ann laid on the ground, looking up at the trumpet vines growing so lushly on the tree, she very quickly formulated a plan of her own. A plan Addison Ann knew would always ensure that her and Atticus Aries could travel safely between here and home. Addison Ann instantly jumped to her feet and dried the few tears she had cried thinking about leaving here from her cheek. She began gently pulling a few of the vines from the tree. They came off easily, root and all. Addison Ann then wound the vines carefully into almost a ball. Atticus Aries knew better than to question what Addison Ann was doing, for once she set her mind to something, there was no stopping her. So off she began silently towards the creek. "Addison Ann," Atticus Aries began, "I marked our way back to the path with stones. That way we'll always be able to find our way back home." Atticus Aries seemed quite proud of himself for having come up with this plan all on his own. But Addison Ann was never one to rely on someone else's plan. She had a plan all her own. A plan that in the end would prove to be a far better option than that of stones, especially if they always wanted to be able to go between there and home. Every time a stone Atticus Aries did spy, Addison Ann would stop and look to the sky. She would find what tree's base got the most sunlight. Then Addison Ann would go to the tree and look for the spot that was just right. There Addison Ann would plant a piece of the vine at the base of the tree. Atticus Aries watched as she dug her hands into the earth, bowing almost reverently to the vine as she kneeled on one knee. Each vine she planted with just the same amount of care. Every time Atticus Aries found a stone, Addison Ann planted a vine to the right of it, right there. At first, Atticus Aries waited for and watched Addison Ann patiently. But as Addison Ann continued to plant a vine at the point of each stone along the way, Atticus Aries began to think that Addison Ann was acting naively. Did Addison Ann really think that these small pieces of vine were going to take root and form a path, or for that matter, even grow? Did she really think this was going to help lead them from home to the meadow? Addison Ann, Atticus Aries began, I've already marked the way. Is this really necessary? We've already been gone most of the day. The sky is getting darker. We're going to lose light soon. Don't worry, Atticus Aries. We'll make it home in time, I promise. And if not, we'll be able to find our way back home with the help of the light of the full moon. Addison Ann continued planting the vines at the base of the trees, and Atticus Aries would stop beside her and wait, but only to appease. When at last up ahead, the creek Addison Ann did spy, she stopped one last time and looked to the sky. Addison Ann dropped to her knee one final time, and it was there, right off the edge of the path, that Addison Ann planted the last piece of vine. Atticus Aries and Addison Ann ran back and forth between their home and the meadow all spring and summer long. They played pirates and fairies. They swam in the pond. They made friends with the hummingbirds and butterflies, who no longer zoomed off if they got too close. It wasn't even out of the ordinary for a butterfly to land on Atticus Aries or Addison Ann's nose. They ran the path through the forest so often that most days they didn't need to look for stones or vines to find their way. Their feet wore a path on the forest floor due to how often they ran through there to play and explore. Atticus Aries and Addison Ann became certain they would never lose their way. Unfortunately, Atticus Aries and Addison Ann were mistaken. For when summer began to turn to fall, the path did not look the same. No, not at all. The once lush green trees all began to lose their leaves, and a beautiful tapestry of color on the forest floor the leaves did weave. The leaves were a beautiful sight to see, but they made the stones and vines harder and harder to find, which put Atticus Aries and Addison Ann in somewhat of a bind. For you see, come fall, the days begin to get much shorter, and there isn't as much sunlight. So there wasn't nearly as much time to play in the meadow, pretending to be autumnal sprites. And not only that, it took them so much longer to find their way there. They had to keep moving leaves off the forest floor. Sometimes the task became more than either wanted to bear. But Atticus Aries and Addison Ann continued nonetheless, for they knew the joy a day in the meadow would bring, even if to get there took much more work than it did in the summer and spring. They would search for their markers along the way there. Then they would have to do it again on their way back home, much to their despair. For each time they ventured to the meadow, their journey seemed to get a little bit tougher. And as fall gave way to winter, it got even rougher. One mid-November day, Addison Ann realized that her trumpet vine had completely died and withered away. She stared at the base of the tree in shock, and for once, Addison Ann, she didn't even know what to say. Atticus Aries saw how sad Addison Ann did feel, so he tried to convince her that it wasn't a big deal. They walked the rest of the way without saying a word. The only sound that could be heard was the crunching of dry leaves and the squawking of a game bird. They followed only Atticus Aries' path there, which was marked with stones. And by the time they returned to the path late that afternoon, the winds had changed, chilling Addison Ann down to her bones. As Atticus Aries and Addison Ann walked home in silence, it began to snow, and in the distance could be heard the crowing of a crow. They huddled together for warmth and support. They walked hand in hand. For this was a day that neither Atticus Aries or Addison Ann had planned. By the time they had arrived back at the creek, the stones had become next to impossible to see. The snow came down so quickly and began getting oh so deep. The quicker the snow fell, the more Atticus Aries wanted to weep. For in the past, he had always loved the snow. But now the soft white blanket that normally brought Atticus Aries such delight covered the stones that lay just below. And with the stones under the snow, Atticus Aries knew that until spring came to the meadow, himself and Addison Ann would not be able to go. They had two paths, two well thought out plans. It seemed impossible that both of them had failed. Neither one could quite understand. Atticus Aries and Addison Ann stayed close to home during the months of winter, for to their own individual hobbies, their time did center. Neither felt much like looking for a new adventure. They wanted the original adventure back, but neither one of them knew how to find their way there. Atticus Aries tried at first to pretend that he didn't care. He made himself busy with schoolwork and such. He kept himself so busy, he didn't have time to think about the meadow. Not too much. While Addison Ann, on the other hand, could think of nothing other than the meadow. She was constantly thinking, planning, and dreaming of a way to get back to the place of their pure childhood bliss. For how the meadows and their carefree days she did miss. Oh, how Addison Ann thought. Oh, how Addison Ann prayed. She spent most of her days dreaming of ways to get back to the place that ignited her spirit and fueled her soul. There was nowhere else on the planet that Addison Ann wanted to be or to go. At first, Atticus Aries would sit and listen and sometimes even reminisce along with Addison Ann in her daydreams. But as the weeks and months wore on, he began to view her daydreams less as dreams and more as schemes. Atticus Aries would retreat to his room with the slamming of his door, and Addison Ann would sit and cry outside his door on the floor. For memories of happier times, Atticus Aries didn't want to hear about, not anymore. For everything there's a season, for everything there's a time. Addison Ann needed to learn to be patient so Atticus Aries could get the meadow off of his mind. Atticus Aries didn't want to reminisce because it reminded him that his path had failed. He couldn't understand why Addison Ann couldn't just be patient and wait for time and the changing of the season to once again make their paths unveiled. Where Atticus Aries had patience, Addison Ann had none. Addison Ann wanted to have fun. She wanted to ice skate on the pond. She wanted to build snowmen and to have snowball fights. She wanted to make snow angels and to bring food to the birds in the meadow. She wanted to do all the winter things her and Atticus Aries had been planning to do in the meadow. Not look out the window at the snow and know that the very thing she was wanting to play in was what was preventing them from being able to go.